Hello everyone and welcome to your next Bridget School lesson for Ancient History. This is Ancient Warfare Part 2, Triremes. So can you do the title, the name and the date? Do not be fooled by the image on the screen. This is not a trireme, you should know what this is. This is a Greek phalanx. So can you just remind yourself briefly, maybe write a quick statement, how did the Greeks fight on land? Pause the video while you do this and then we'll carry on. So before we go into the specifics, the first question we really need to ask ourselves is, why is it that naval warfare was so important to the Greeks? Why is it that the Greeks of all people developed this? Well, if you look at the map, there's an obvious answer, and the answer is islands. Greece and the Ionian Greece are separated by the Aegean Sea. A lot of the important Greek states are separated by water. So the fact that it's all islands, it's not a real surprise they developed naval warfare tactics, probably more than, say, the Egyptians, who have significantly more desert. So, obvious geography aside, it's not just the geography that's the reason why the Greeks developed naval warfare in the way they did. As they grew more powerful, they traded with other countries a lot. It's not just that, as their populations grew, Greece is not an overly fertile part of the world, they needed to send colonists and people further and further. So they were very into their exploration and their colonisation. And trade again was really, really important. Greece is very hilly, so the easiest way to get from one place to another was by sea. Their love of maths and inventing things like this, and navigation particularly, meant that this was a key skill they could develop. Now, obviously they're very skilled at sailing and navigation, but what they found was that they needed warships to keep trade ships and transports safe. So this is why naval warfare developed so specifically. So your first task is quite simply to get familiar with this concept of naval warfare by looking at various images, particularly of triremes. And what you'll need to do is you'll need to open the Word document that is called Trireme, where you will have a similar version of this image. All I want you to do, ideally, you could label the image with the specific things, but I'm going to talk you through the key features of a trireme, and you need to record, ideally on this, what these are. So let's start. So one thing you will notice about the trireme is that it has a sail. The sail was only for transporting the ship to where it was meant to fight. You could not rely on the direction of the wind or the amount of wind in a battle. Greeks were skilled sailors, but the sail was only to get them from harbour to where they were going to scrap. When they went into battle, the sail and the mast would be taken off to make it lighter. In terms of powering the trireme then, if you look at the sides, you will see there are 3 decks of oars, hence the name trireme. We'll look at these in a bit more detail in a minute, but this is ultimately the power behind the ship. This is how it was powered, particularly in battle. If you're going on a long journey, these oars would likely be stashed and stored, but realistically, when it came to fighting, you couldn't rely on the wind. This was your power. At the back, you've got this nice wooden chair at the back, which is where the captain would sit, and next to him 2 rudders. These directed the direction of the ship. This pointed it in the right way. The ship is entirely made of wood, but it's got this long curved feature to make not only it more aerodynamic, but a bit stronger. Now, one of the most important parts of the trireme is at the front. So you'll see it's got a nice painted eye. This was not uncommon in Greece. They like to make their ships look scary by painting faces on them. But just below the eye is this kind of beak, this bronze ram. This was really important because the easiest way to think about ancient Greek naval warfare and ancient naval warfare ultimately was like a massive game of dodgems. So this bow and this bronze ram were hugely important. So on this part of the video you can see almost like a cross section of the inside of a trireme, and the important thing is the 3 decks of oarsmen. These things, they were significant in size and they took a lot of people to power them. And it's not just the number of people, it required a lot of skill. You had to have large numbers of oarsmen, 3 rows at a time, rowing in exact synchronization in order to power forward. But this was the key to the trireme, these 3 layers of oars. There were things such as biremes, which only had 2 layers of oars. They were obviously not as powerful. This was the engine of the ship, and this ultimately determined how effective this ship was in a war. The more power you could get behind that bronze ram, the more powerful and more deadly your ship. So on this slide what you see is a comparison, or a fanciful comparison, between Greek and Persian ships. Realistically, once this design had proven itself to be effective and become popular, the trireme design became universal rather than just being a Greek thing. It lasted right throughout the ancient world and into the Roman period and beyond. What you will see, I mean, it suggests they don't know the seating configuration of Persian ships, but realistically it will have been the same. The designs are very similar, they all have bronze rams. Interestingly, you'll find is that on the Persian ship it is lined with shields on the deck. This is not uniquely Persian. Very often as well, given the nature of fighting at sea, Greek and Persian ships would be manned by marines, soldiers who would fight on the ships as well. So if you couldn't ram into the opposing ship, you would simply have soldiers on board who would leap across onto the enemy ship, a bit like pirates, and try and hack and slash their way through the enemy ship and try and destroy it that way. Also on the bottom of this video, completely useless to some extent I understand, is a link to a YouTube video. This will be on your Battle of Salamis sheet, your Herodotus sheet. This will give you a link to a reconstruction of a Greek trireme. This ship is called the Olympias. It was built by experimental archaeologists to ancient specifications, and it gives you, the music is ridiculously dramatic, sorry about that, but it gives you some idea of the actual proportions and nature of these things. So that ends the part of the lesson where you need to look at the nature and structure of a trireme. I would like you to resubmit your description or your labelled diagram back to Google Classroom. But now, as we've said, the whole point of these things, these are military ships. The whole aim of them is for them to fight at sea. So we're just going to I'm going to briefly talk through how the Greeks particularly fought at sea, and then you're going to start on your next task. So, like we've said before, the aim is to try and drive that bronze ram ideally into the weak sides, or the long sides of your enemy's ship. If you look at the little blue diagram on the board, or on the screen, sorry, the idea is that ships would try and surround other ships and just crash into the side and try and ideally break them in half. So there's 3 different ways they could do this. The first one was sail for a gap in the enemy line, then swerve at the last minute to smash into their sides. And commanders of these ships were incredibly skilled. The alternative would be to sail directly towards the front of an enemy ship, and again swerving at the last minute and pulling your oars in, and the idea there would be to smash the enemy's oars. Again, this relies on incredible coordination. If you smash the enemy's oars, they are powerless, they are a sitting target, and you can just simply turn around and come and crash into them again. The third alternative is to sail around to the far end of the enemy line, because they would fight in lines very similar to think of it like a phalanx at sea. Sail around to the far end of the enemy line, turn quickly and either attack from the side or behind. So you're trying to get your ship around that bronze ram on the other ship and crashing into the side. This was obviously incredibly difficult in some parts of the sea. So one good example of when Greek naval warfare really hit its stride was during the Persian Wars in 480, and particularly at the Battle of Salamis. Salamis is a tiny strait of water just outside Athens, and here you saw one of the quintessential naval battles of the ancient world, and particularly of the Greek world. So looking at the Battle of Salamis, this is again one of these huge conflicts between East and West that we see typically in this period. The huge Persian fleet of over 1,000 triremes faced a much smaller fleet of 380 ships in the Strait of Salamis. Obviously, as it says on the screen, the numbers are according to Herodotus, who is a Greek historian. He's writing shortly after the end of the war, so his numbers are exaggerated on both sides. And it all looked lost for the Greeks, but what was really important about this battle was, despite their spectacular numbers, the Persians were unable to defeat the Greeks, and they were actually completely decimated. The Greeks completely pull the situation around and absolutely rout the Persians and rout the king Xerxes, who ends up running away. And this is going to be our example we're going to look at. So now you need to start and open your Herodotus sheet on the Battle of Salamis. And again, there you go. On the board you've got an example of Greek ships ramming into Persian ships. So what I want you to do, read the brief extract, and it is only brief. And the key thing we'll look at is I want you to pick out any details about how the Greeks fought at sea. So any detail of what they actually did, pick out any details. If you want to just highlight them, that's fine, or if you want to make a list, even better. And then the second question we need to ask is, what can we learn from the passage about why the Greeks won at Salamis? A lot of the battle that took place was due to the cunning and skill of the Greek commander, an Athenian called Themistocles, but it can't just be down to one person. The Greeks also had a lot else going on for them. So we've got two things I want you to do. Pick out any details about how the Greeks fought at sea, answer this question: what can we learn from the passage about why the Greeks won at the Battle of Salamis? This should be a short, relatively short answer. Think of it like a 10-mark GCSE question, so really about half the page. Use quotes from the extract where you can, and can you upload this back to Google Classroom? That's it for this week, and until next time, thank you very much and goodbye.